for our purposes is that by the time of Kennedy's assassination, Mitford's book had infiltrated the Kennedy circle. Robert, his brother, had read it, as had Jack and Jackie's close friend, William Walton, his brother-in-law, Sergeant Shriver, and possibly, but not proven, even Jack and Jackie themselves. Unfortunately, unbeknownst to Jackie, the involvement of a funeral home had already been discussed in Washington earlier that day. Not only did they need a new casket, and boy howdy did they need a new casket, but despite Robert and Jackie's wishes that the military hospital, and only the hospital, handle the president's remains, it was not possible. While the hospital could do the embalming, quote, the military isn't equipped to prepare the remains. That is, they weren't restorative embalmers. They couldn't do the work to make Kennedy look like Kennedy again. He needed major reconstruction, and for that, he had to go to a specialized funeral home. Enter Joseph Gawler's Sons, a prestige funeral home that had been handling high-profile state deaths in Washington, D.C. since 1850. Gawler's had handled the remains of President Taft and President Franklin Roosevelt. Their viewing hours were even a tourist attraction in D.C. But first, they had to perform the autopsy. After accidentally leaving Kennedy in his casket behind with his makeshift pallbearers for 5 minutes outside Bethesda, the error was realized and Kennedy's casket was brought. Only, once they were there, they realized that the stairway leading to the morgue doors was too narrow for the casket to fit. There was more manhandling and more banging up of the already broken casket. Could we just put him on a gurney or something? We can't do this anymore. It's simultaneously the best argument for having funeral directors to handle the body and the best argument against funeral directors, since they're the reason this monstrosity of an overpriced, hermetically sealed casket even existed in the first place.
All our humans are one.
When the casket finally made it into the morgue, the Handley Britannia casket was open. And no, the plastic and rubber had not protected the interior of the casket from the carnage. Kennedy's remains were moved to an autopsy table by the Navy team that would perform the autopsy. Kennedy lay naked on the table. Aside from his head wound, he was remarkably unblemished. For hours, doctors performed an autopsy of the president, taking photos, extracting bullet fragments, examining the body for entry and exit wounds. A fragment of the president's skull had been found on Elm Street and had been sent to Bethesda. Said Lieutenant Richard Lipsey, who was present for the autopsy, there was no question in their minds that the bullets all came from the same direction. What if this suddenly became a second shooter on the grassy knoll video? It's not going to. Would it not be? And conspiracy people in the audience, and I know there are conspiracy people in the audience, I just want to talk about rising cremation rates through American history. Don't come for me. Was the CIA involved? Was Russia involved? Who knows? You know who was involved? Jesse. By midnight, the autopsy was finally finished. All during this time, Jackie, Robert, and Kennedy's people had been discussing the funeral, as well as who would handle the cosmetic reconstruction of the president, should there be a viewing, which was absolutely in question. Jackie remained in her stained suit, still exhibiting enormous compassion to those who had loved her husband. Though the autopsy was finished, the president still needed a new casket, so Ken O'Donnell and Larry O'Brien, another Kennedy advisor and Irish Mafia member, went to Gawler's to get a casket. There's some confusion as to what happened at Gawler's. In the spirit of Mitford, O'Brien requested the plainest one you have in the middle price range, and he was shown choices by Gawler's. Robert Kennedy thought he spoke to Gawler's about a moderately priced $1,400 casket, a point Gawler's does not recall. But a $2,000 casket was selected, and with it, the most expensive vault in the establishment. The total came to $3,160, which was not what Robert had asked for. Gawler's brought the casket to Bethesda, where their embalming and reconstruction team, supervised by Joe Gawler's chief assistant, Joe Hagan, went to work, attempting to fill and rebuild the president's missing skull and exposed brain with cotton and plaster. They worried the whole time about potential leakage from the skull, a very relatable funeral director concern. They worked until approximately 4 a.m. to set his face, return his pallor, and try to bring him back to the Jack Kennedy his wife and brother mourned. Journalist Jim Bishop reported that the morticians were, in a manner of speaking, magicians.
Oh, he's beautiful.
They repaired the president's shattered skull, layer by layer, quote, whispering incantations to each other, until Kennedy was whole again. They dressed him, put a rosary in his hands, and placed him into the new casket, made of gleaming African mahogany. As this was happening, tensions continued to rise around the question. Jackie did not want an open casket, but Robert Kennedy and Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara believed that a president belonged to the people, and his casket must be open. I want the coffin closed so badly. You can't have it open, Jackie insisted to McNamara in the kitchen at Bethesda. It can't be done, Jackie. Everybody wants to see the head of state. I don't care, she said. And she said of his embalmed body, it's the most awful, morbid thing. They have to remember Jack alive. Said McNamara later, the tension in that kitchen was unimaginable. In the small hours of the morning, President Kennedy returned home to the White House, the path to the north portico lit by small flames. The light in the East Room glowed. Military pallbearers carried the president's casket to the East Room and placed it upon a catafalque. A priest said a prayer, as did Jackie. She then turned and went upstairs, leaving Robert to keep his promise to her that he'd settle the question of an open or closed casket. Robert asked the military death watch, a group of men who had stayed vigilant at the dead president's side, to leave, and approached his brother's casket, the lid already opened for him. He looked down at his brother for the first time and realized there was no way his brother could be seen by the public this way. He exited the East Room and asked some other close friends to go look at the embalmed and reconstructed body, letting them know Jackie wants it covered. They would echo those words back, saying things like, it's a horror, it's too waxen, too made up. The Kennedy's dearest friend, William Warren, said, you mustn't keep it open. It has no resemblance to the president. It's a wax dummy. It, he said, not him. Robert agreed and said, close it. And so it was. At Jackie's request, the casket was opened one final time on Sunday before President Kennedy went to the Capitol Rotunda to lie in state. Jackie wanted Robert and her to have some last moments of privacy with Jack. She asked Special Agent Hill to get her some scissors, and she cut a lock of Jack's hair. As of 12:46 p.m. on Sunday, November 24, 1963, President Kennedy's casket would never open again. Seeing him again, she was pleased with the decision to leave the casket closed. It isn't Jack, she thought. It isn't Jack. 250,000 people came to pay their final respects to President Kennedy. The casket remained shut. While Jackie and Robert did not fully get their wish that a funeral home would not be involved, they kept a tight grip on what this state funeral would be. No 5-foot-tall cross and silver candlesticks that Gawlers brought in, only flowers and simplicity. Well, simplicity for a state funeral of a sitting president, anyway. And this is really the question. How much did Kennedy belong to the people, and how much did he belong to Jackie and his family? Even I am torn on this. In many ways, I think Jackie did an elegant job of the balance. There is no doubt that Jackie indulged in public presidential pageantry for the benefit of a country in mourning. The same caisson that carried Lincoln also carried Kennedy to St. Matthew's Cathedral for the funeral mass, and then to Arlington National Cemetery, the cemetery Jackie chose as opposed to a Catholic cemetery, precisely because Jackie did believe he belonged to the nation. She chose to walk behind the caisson. Jackie remained very from the music to the acting and She had already sat for a full day, covered in her husband's blood. She wasn't interested in turning that physical destruction with the reconstructed waxy image of his face. Something that is often forgotten is that just 3 months before Kennedy was assassinated, Jackie Kennedy had given birth to her son, Patrick lived just 2 days before dying of infant respiratory distress. Jackie would still have been in grief for her son, but her husband was also dead. Maybe she no longer felt it was her job, everything to the public, and work now required something more. What Jackie seemed to want was just access to her husband's home, as it truly was chaotic. Time for rituals, like giving him her ring, and cutting locks of hair, and dropping in letters from her children. She obviously was uncomfortable with funeral, but to be fair, she didn't want anyone around her husband other than her close friends. When Jackie persisted, more than 30 years later, in 1994, we saw the same tension unfold. She made choices for privacy and intimacy. Her body was embalmed in her own bathroom and raked right in her living room. Yet she also understood her public duty and would be buried in Hollywood next to her husband in the same model of mahogany casket. Her son Patrick was buried here. And you'll probably wonder, you may not wonder, what happened to O'Neill's original casket? 2 months after President Kennedy was buried, Vernon O'Neill requested the federal government to pay him $3,995 for the casket. That's the equivalent of $37,000 in today's money. When the government balked, he dropped the price to $3,495. This public attempt to run collections on Jackie Kennedy caused a large drop-off in his business. O'Neill really would have preferred the original casket back instead, given that he had gotten offers of $100,000 for the casket from collectors. The Kennedy family insisted the government just pay for the casket and O'Neill's services, a final settlement of $3,160, and the casket was taken into the government's possession. In late 1965, a bill was passed to preserve anything associated with Kennedy's assassination. But because the casket was discarded and considered surplus, except to those, quote, morbidly curious, it was decided it should be destroyed. On February 18, 1966, the casket was flown 100 miles east of Washington to a spot in John F. Kennedy's beloved Atlantic Ocean. At 10 a.m., the casket, drilled with holes and weighted with sandbags, was pushed into the ocean from an aircraft, where it quickly sank. Apparently, Kennedy had spoken about a desire to be buried at sea. And as if evidence of how much the funeral industry had changed since the Kennedy assassination and Jessica Mitford, in 1999, after John F. Kennedy Jr.'s tragic death in a plane crash, his recovered remains were cremated, taken out to the Atlantic, some 100 or so miles from his father's first doomed casket, and committed to the sea. Thank you, as always, to our patrons, who give us the space for this level of research and the opportunity to travel and film in places like Dallas and the 6th Floor Museum at Dealey Plaza, which appears in
The hold by Brock Miller, and he makes it. It went to the left, but just good enough. And Nick Rose gives New Jersey a 3-point lead with 1:49 left on the clock.
What a clutch kick by Nick Rose, stepping up after 2 misses. A great series by DeAndre Johnson, and Rose. That is manning up and making a kick right there, giving the Generals a 3-point lead.
In center field right here, we got Kevin Kiermaier. All the way over here, we have Randy Arozarena. Pay attention to the State Farm sign. And Yankees in Toronto, 1-run game in the 8th inning. Judges up and Boone just chilling, blowing bubbles.